Welcome to the Friday Circle podcast, a collection of Islamic reminders and circles to recharge your iman.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. My apologies for my lateness. We've got a lot to cover today, and inshallah we're going to try and do it within the hour. So very quickly to recap where we left off last time. This is meant to be a three-part series chronicalizing the last 100 years of the Ummah, such that we can take the actual benefits of what happened and why it happened and what we can learn from, everything that has happened in this last 100 years. Last time, before that, in the first series, the first part, we spoke about how the Khilafah fell after World War I. We knew that the Ottoman Empire, the last Muslim empire, was in its last legs. It was completely corrupt. We know that the Arab revolt against the Ottomans was one of the reasons why it fell, eventually, leading to the collapse of the Khilafah in 1924. And last time we spoke about what happened after that. After the fall of the Khilafah, what was the state of the Muslim world at that time, and what did Muslims do to respond to that state? So we said that after the fall of the Khilafah, we had a world that looked like this, as in the modern borders of the Muslim world were drawn up after World War I had ended in Paris. They cut the Muslim world and they formalized these countries as we see them, as we know them today. That's the situation we found ourselves in. Now, during that period, last week we were talking about the 1920s to the 1970s. In this period, what we had was a situation of secular nationalist leaders in the Muslim world. And they had popular support at that time because they were anti-colonial. They railed against the British and the French, and they threw the British and the French out of their countries. So they had popular support. They also stood on a platform of, being nationalist but not religious, Arab but not, overtly Muslim, even though they presented themselves as Muslim. But really the platform that they stood on was, we are nationalists, we are independent, we are going against the imperial forces that controlled our lands. So they got public support for a time. The thing is, they stood on a very anti-Islamic platform, as in they suppressed the Islamic will, if you like, which is to say that revivalists appeared during that period, the 1920s to the 1970s, and we spoke about these being the four main ones. So we had Ikhwan al-Muslimin, we had Jamaat al-Islam, we had the Tabligh, and we had the Salafis. Last time we spoke mainly about Ikhwan al-Muslimin, because to be fair, they, in this period, 1920s to the 1970s, were the most dominant revivalist movement. Essentially, they all wanted the same thing. Revivalists want to, as is in the name, they want to revive Islam. They want to bring back the Sharia. They want Islamic determination. Everyone wants it, but everyone has different ways to get to that end goal. The Ikhwan were the main people at that time that were, I would say, the most influential. And we spoke about the origins of it. We don't need to spend too much time talking about it again. Hassan al-Banna was the man that originated it. He was a primary school teacher that started up the basic Boy Scouts. That's how it all began. Boy Scouts, they weren't called that, but essentially that was the idea. Sports activities, education, teaching them about their deen, about their history. And then it snowballed into a big movement. We said that they had three branches. They were calling people, mainly the poor, towards Islam, the da'wah. And generally it was the poor that were listening to them. They had the social welfare program, the grassroots movement. So they were building hospitals, and they were helping feeding the poor and the weak, and they were building education systems and schools. They also had a political wing. And that political wing had the simple ambition, which is, we are Muslims, we should be ruled by the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is the one that we're more interested in today. Because you see, and I'm going to be very critical about the Ikhwan today, because we need to understand, okay, what is it that was the problem? Where did it all go wrong? That's really what I'm focused on here. I said that there was a structure in which the Ikhwan was built around. This is the most important thing that I want you to focus on, right? They had a tariqah method. It was kind of inspired by the Sufi tradition, the Sufi orders. That's what a tariqah is, a Sufi order. Now, you essentially don't join, you're co-opted to the Ikhwan. They choose you. They give da'wah to you, and when you're ready, they sort of bring you into their movement. That was the idea of it. Now, there was a murshid-student dynamic. You had a leader that would sort of, guide you towards a higher level of spiritual life. That was essentially how things developed in the beginning. But what the system of the Ikhwan depended on was complete obedience to the person who's above you in that structure. Very hierarchical. So if you're one of the low end, the youth, for example, in the Ikhwan, you have to blindly obey. So it wasn't an emphasis on being critical to those who are above, rather just to obey them, to follow them, because they're the ones with experience, they're the ones that know what they're doing. You have to obey their position. Long story short, from their development from the 1928 to the 1930s, it was radically successful. Hundreds of thousands of people joined because of the da'wah, because of the grassroots. They were gaining popularity amongst the poor in Egypt, and they were doing extremely well, such that the founder was assassinated, Hassan al-Banna, in 1948. That didn't matter so much in that the Ikhwan carried on, and their da'wah improved. And by the time we got into the 1950s, they were very, very strong within Egyptian society. Then came a man that you see in front of you, or two men, should I say. One of them, the one on the left of the screen, was a man called Sayyid Qutb, rahmatullahi alayh. The other one was Jamal Abdel Nasser. Jamal Abdel Nasser was the leader that came into power in 1952 in Egypt by a military coup. They were supported by the Ikhwan al-Muslimin at that time because they overthrew the monarchy that was ruling over Egypt at that time. Of course, the Ikhwan wanted to remove the monarchy, so they were happy to support Jamal Abdel Nasser at that point in time. The problems emerged immediately after the coup, because Jamal Abdel Nasser was a nationalist, an Arab nationalist, and he was calling towards something very different to the Ikhwan. He was calling towards Arab nationalism, pan-Arab nationalism. Not just in Egypt, across Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, we're all Arabs, we should rule continuously over this land. Whereas the Muslims, or the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, are calling towards something very different, which is pan-Islamism, as in we are Muslims and we should rule as Muslim regardless of whether you're Arab or non-Arab. Very different message. So the problems started to emerge between these two groups. Jamal Abdel Nasser had the power, so there could only be one winner in this situation. And the main man, the mouthpiece of the Ikhwan at that time was this man, Sayyid Qutb, rahmatullahi alayh. I don't want to spend too much on time on it, but long story short, he was put in prison by Jamal Abdel Nasser because of what he was saying openly against the government, because of the problems that Jamal Abdel Nasser was having with Ikhwan al-Muslimin. He was put in prison at that time, eventually executed in 1966. And the Ikhwan al-Muslimin were forced underground by that government and further governments after Jamal Abdel Nasser. Just as a side note to Sayyid Qutb, he wrote one of his most famous works whilst he was in prison. It was called Ma'alim fi Tariq. It's called Milestones. And he wasn't allowed a pen, he wasn't allowed paper. This is just a side point, it's beside the point. He wasn't allowed paper. And he wrote, not only did he write Milestones, he revised his tafsir, fi Dhilal al-Quran, in prison. How did he do that? With the food that they gave him, it was ta'miyah, falafel, basically, Egyptian falafel. They would give it to him in this sort of like scrap paper. They'd wrap it in paper, give it to him. He would collect that paper. And over time, he would, have a corpus of papers, and someone managed to smuggle him a pencil or a pen, which he would use to write and smuggle that work out. Incredible, really, when you think about the determination. They refused him the actual means to be able to write, yet that didn't stop him. He wrote his most, outstanding works whilst he was in that position of absolute oppression, which is, I guess you could say, why there is so much sincerity and there's so much passion in the words if you were to read it. So they remained underground for a long period of time until we got to, of course, the Arab Spring. I'm not going to be talking about that yet. I'm going to jump forward today, you see, because we had this man here, which I'm sure everyone knows, Mohammed Morsi, who recently passed away, rahimahullah. Now, it all kind of fell apart at that point when they actually had the opportunity to take power. And again, I don't want to focus on that because there are many other things that I'm going to be speaking about today. I just want to go straight to where it all went wrong, because we could talk about the Arab Spring, we could talk about how the Ikhwan came into power, and so on and so forth. I just want to point out a few benefits as to where I feel the mistakes were made. You see, the first thing is, it's the political where everything came undone. They were excellent in terms of the da'wah. They were excellent in terms of the grassroots movement, in terms of building hospitals, in terms of the education. It was all so good, and they built up so much goodwill amongst the Egyptian people over so long. And then it all failed so spectacularly in such a short amount of time. Part of it was out of their control. They had a media that was against them from day one. They had the whole deep state against them. The military were against them. The police were against them. Everything was going against them. But they made some fundamental mistakes that, essentially led to their downfall. One of them being that structure that I mentioned. That hierarchical structure remained in place. The very blind obedience from bottom to top, where you can't really question anything and you have to just go with the instincts of those who are above you. That led to them not being able to be dynamic. They weren't dynamic because they didn't respond to the changes. The structure of the actual organization meant that there wasn't enough criticism going on. So those at top were unable to actually react to the changing times. They were too eager for power too soon. They didn't think it through. This is just a very broad summary of what I'm saying. And they were not intellectually prepared for power. If you look through the organization of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, there are people with lots of PhDs, and there were very highly qualified, very intelligent men within that organization. But their qualifications lied in medicine, in engineering, in other areas like that. If you look about social sciences, political theory, governance, they had very little experience, very little understanding. They were not street savvy. So they made fundamental errors, and they said things that were going to create them problems within that time. This is, as I said, very broad, and I'm generalizing very much. But that's not the point. The point is the lessons that we can draw from that time, because there are many. And I'm just going to go through them before I talk about the next part of this. You see, think about how it began with Hassan al-Banna. It was one man, primary school teacher, just decided to start teaching kids. And from that came the most influential, perhaps the most influential Muslim movement of the 20th century. So humble beginnings is where it's at. And it's a lesson for all of us. The point is not the actual outcome, it's taking your first steps towards actually making a change, having the ikhlas and the sincerity to actually think about doing something. Asking yourself the question, what is it that I can do to help this ummah, regardless of how large or how insignificant it is? The very fact that you take that first step, and then it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's actually going to give it the tawfiq. And even if there are no fruits of that labor in this world, in the akhirah, Allah will recompense you in ways that you can never imagine. From those humble beginnings came something spectacular. So we can all take from that. Our strength will be derived from our connection to our deen. What did Hassan al-Banna do? What did he see? What was the problem at hand? People were not connected to the source, which was the Quran and the Sunnah. So the first thing that he did was connect them to their source and connect them to their history, give them some identity, give them some pride. So he started teaching not just Islam, but Islamic history as well, so that they could connect, so that they actually knew where they came from. Because what did he see in his society? He saw young Muslim Egyptians looking towards the West, dressing like those that came from the West and behaving like them. They wanted to enter into Western society because they saw them as the movers and the shakers of the world, and they wanted to be like them. He took that away and he said, no, look at what we have achieved. Look at the people that have come from the Islamic tradition. He reconnected them with that. Now, one thing that we can learn from the mistakes of the Ikhwan al-Muslimin is the fact that they were unable to evolve. They remained stagnant. They did not understand that they had to change if they were going to move in from a position of opposition to a position of power. So we have to actually understand that we as a people, individuals and collectively, we have to be very self-reflective, self-critical. We have to listen to one another and not be afraid to take criticism. And the social sciences have to play a role in the future for this ummah. We need to actually understand that if we are to be a people that are going to exert ourselves upon this ummah, we need to actually learn the social sciences, be people of the social sciences. Like I said, there are a lot of doctors, alhamdulillah, that are coming out of the ummah, and a lot of people going into academic realms. But what we are perhaps underrepresented in is the social sciences, political theory, sociology, understanding how the world works. We need more from that area. That's what the Ikhwan teaches me when I read about them. Okay, going forward, there's two other groups. You see, there are three groups that I want to talk about over the course of this 100 years. The first was the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. The other two I'm going to be talking about today are the Salafis and the AK party in Turkey. They're the two people that I want to focus on. But to do so, I just want to give you a broad brush about the actual history of the Muslim Ummah from the 1980s to the present day. Because it's no good talking about these different groups unless you have the context of what was going on during that time. So it helps you understand, it informs you about these groups. As I spoke about the context of that first period, which was World War I. So very, very quickly and very broadly, we pick up from the 1980s. Now, as you know from last time, we have a period of secular nationalists, and they were quite popular for a period, the 1920s to the 70s. The Arabs supported people like Jamal Abdel Nasser. He was extremely charismatic, and he won the hearts of many Arabs because he was calling for independence. But that whole project collapsed spectacularly by the time we got to the 1980s. No one believed in it anymore. It didn't achieve anything. And then we had something that happened in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution happened and a man called Ayatollah Khomeini came into power in Iran, which was a direct consequence of imperialism. You see, in 1953, a man called Mossadegh came into power, who was removed promptly by the Americans because he wanted to nationalize Iranian oil, which led to them imposing a dictator, a king, the Shah, which led to people hating him so much, which led them to supporting a man called Ayatollah Khomeini, which led to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. That was what was going on in Iran. In Afghanistan, in the 80s, we had the Russian-Afghani war, which lasted nearly a decade. And as you can see, there's the Mujahideen that are sitting around one man. His name was Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States. He was at that time calling them the freedom fighters of the world and giving them support and giving them arms, which eventually they would use against the United States of America. So we have a situation now where the old order is shifting. We have dictators who are now controlling the Middle East. And these dictators are no longer popular anymore with the people. So we have a situation where Muslims are becoming more militant about how they're going about things because there is a frustration that's creeping in. And then in the 1990s, we have the Gulf War. The Gulf War is when America invaded Iraq. I'm not going to go into the details as to why it happened, but they essentially tried to topple Saddam Hussein. They eventually decided not to, and they pulled out of it. But as I said, what we have now is secular dictators that become more and more unpopular. We have jihadi movements that are emerging in the Muslim world and growing frustration amongst Muslim people, which leads, if you have frustration and anger for a long period of time and no one is addressing those concerns, militancy is inevitable. And that militancy led to certain people like, for example, Osama bin Laden to emerge, like Al-Qaeda to emerge. And of course, in 2001, we know what happened, a game changer. 9/11, Twin Towers, 2 planes flew into them, changed the whole dynamic of the Muslim world because now we have, from 2001 onwards, the latest paradigm, which is the war on terror. So, very quickly, 2001, Afghanistan gets invaded. 2003, Iraq gets invaded once more. So we have this period where now the Muslim world is becoming bombarded by American military domination, as opposed to the stability. So remember this, we had a period of stability, secular dictators. Now we have a period of instability as America is trying to regain control of this period. At that same time, something interesting was going on, and we're going to be talking more about it. A man called Recep Tayyip Erdogan comes into power in Turkey. And another This hugely significant thing happens in 2011. As I said, people are frustrated. They have been for a long period of time. And then the Arab Spring happens. The Arab Spring, where it was a popular uprising across the Arab world. It started in Tunisia, moved on to Egypt and Yemen and Syria and other places. It was non-ideological, it was non-religious. People were simply fed up with the fact that they had no money, no food, they couldn't live a dignified life, they had no freedom. They were tired of living under despots for generation after generation, and it was like this spontaneous eruption of anger that led to people trying to bring about change. Of course, it failed spectacularly, we'll talk about that. But with that failure came other movements. You had the sort of the democratic side, and then you had militant movements with the collapse of the Arab Spring, and you had groups emerging like ISIS and other militant groups in Syria because of the collapse of the Arab Spring, because it turned into a complete bloodbath. Militancy was the inevitability after that. That's from 1980 to the present day. And like I said, it's a broad brush. I'm generalizing. I just want you to have a background before we talk about the two groups that I want to talk about. The first of which is the Salafis. It's so important to understand this group because we are all, I would say, experiencing Islam through the eyes of Salafiyah. We're all influenced by the Salafi da'wah, really. Even if you perhaps don't identify yourself as a Salafi, the very fact that it has been so influential in the last half of the 20th century, we as Muslims now have been so deeply influenced by it that, it affects all of us in the way we perceive Islam. Very, very simply, I've split them up into three groups. The Salafi movement, to understand them in a simple way. It's more complicated than this, but you could say you have the quietist Salafis, you have the political Salafis, and you have the jihadi Salafis. Now, the quietists are those that don't speak out against rulers. They want to just remain quiet, they want to give their da'wah, and they don't want to get involved in the political process. Now, that group can be subdivided, but we're not going to go into the details of that. This group has been supported, and the reason it has been so successful in giving da'wah, and the reason why we, as I said, are experiencing Islam through Salafi eyes, is because the Saudi government has effectively bankrolled this da'wah. So they revived the texts of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. They revived the text of Ibn Taymiyyah. They allowed the da'wah to spread across the world. And they were given free pass to do so because the Americans supported the Saudi government ever since World War II, when they made an agreement. Abdulaziz ibn Saud made an agreement with Roosevelt, who was the man in charge at that time, that they would have the protection of the Americans, just as long as the Americans would have a good, clean supply of oil from Saudi Arabia. So that was able to spread, which is a good thing. It's a good thing because the Muslim world benefited from this. At that time, there was a lot of ignorance, and it was the Salafi da'wah that brought people back to the sources, the Quran and the Sunnah. It was the Salafi da'wah that reconnected people to their deen in a more authentic way, that removed all of the misconceptions and perhaps the inaccuracies with the way people were practicing their deen. So a lot of good came out of this. There were a lot of great ulama like Sheikh Uthaymeen and Sheikh bin Baz that came out of this quietist movement. Now, I say quietist, I don't mean that they supported the Saudi regime. I just say they didn't speak out openly against them. There's a subgroup that came from that did support the Saudi regime, and perhaps many of us know about them. Some call them the Madakhila, some call them, super, whatever name you call them. They are a subgroup that I don't want to spend too much time on because I don't think they deserve it, and there are more important things at hand. There was a different kind of Salafi. That was the political Salafi. And they were the ones like, for example, Salman al-Awda, who is at the moment in prison in Saudi Arabia on death row for a tweet that he put out calling for unity. They were similar in terms of the beliefs that they believed in, but they argued that we should engage in the political process. We are the ones that have and hold the knowledge that we need to affect change. We need to speak. We shouldn't overthrow rulers, but we should speak out against them, or we should encourage them towards good. We should be more vocal, and we should use our knowledge and our influence to bring about good in terms of political reform. And there was movements in Saudi Arabia like Sahwa that emerged from this. And then you had the jihadi Salafis, a different kind. So you can see that Salafiyya is not one monolithic group. There are all kinds of different movements, and this is a simplification. The jihadis essentially were so disenchanted with the situation of the Muslim world. They were so disillusioned with the political process that they thought that the only way that we can bring about what we want, which everyone wants, which is the self-determination of the Muslim world, which is a Muslim world run by the Sharia, the only way we can do this is by dropping this political process and moving towards militancy. And that happened perhaps from the 80s all the way to the current day. Before we break, I just want to talk about the evolution of this movement that I'm talking about. It's very interesting, you see, because Salafiyya has been around for a long time, but it really came into its own in the 1990s. Just as the Ikhwan al-Muslimin became insignificant, the Salafiyya just exploded. Now, the reason being is a few. One of them I already said. The Saudi Arabian government was bankrolling it. Jami'at al-Medina was creating learned people, scholars. People like Sheikh Uthaymeen were given free pass to actually spread the knowledge. So the Saudi element had a big part to play in all of this. But there was also Egyptian Salafiyya, which was incredibly influential. You see, satellite TV started to emerge in the Arab world in the 1990s. And the Salafi ulama of Egypt were allowed to actually present themselves on these TV networks. And the reason being, the reason they were given that freedom to speak and give the da'wah and call to Islam, and these are a few of them, Muhammad Hassan being one of them, he was one of the most famous of them, is that the government, it suited the government that they would call people to Islam, because they were calling to a non-political Islam. They were calling people to the Quran and the Sunnah, and it was beautiful. And these people were beautiful people, and they were calling and speaking incredible things about the stories of the Sahaba and the Seerah and all of these great things. But they were not talking about political engagement. So it suited the power at that time, particularly as the Ikhwan al-Muslimin were very political. So they thought this is a good counterweight to take people away from the political side, those that are inclined towards religion, and bring them towards a more apolitical, unengaged Islam. So it suited them. So the unintended consequence was the incredible da'wah that these people did, regardless of the fact that they weren't engaging politically. The effect that they had in reconnecting people across the Arab world and the West to Islam, they had a huge impact. So really it was very positive during that time. Then things changed radically. The Arab Spring of 2011 and what that did to Salafiyya. You see, when the Arab Spring broke out, particularly in Egypt, as I said, there was no ideology behind it. People were angry, they were fed up, they took to the streets. The Salafis took the position that we don't engage in this, we don't protest, we don't engage in this process. But once the protests led to the removal of the president at that time, which was Hosni Mubarak, and there were talk of the secularists coming into charge, or even the Muslim Brotherhood. The Salafi groups are thinking, well, if we don't act now, then the secularists are going to come in. We either stay out of politics, or we get involved now and we are able to actually influence the political process. So they shifted their position overnight, literally overnight. From one of we don't engage in politics to we have to engage in politics, wajib, to engage in politics. They went from haram to wajib, literally, which tells you that their position on politics it wasn't a theological position for most Salafis. I'm not talking about the Madkhalis, I'm talking about most Salafis. It was strategic. They decided at a certain time that it wasn't smart to engage in politics, but once the space opened for them, they decided, okay, you have to engage now. If we don't engage, then we lose forever. So they entered into the political process. They put forward candidates to be elected. 25% of the vote went to the Salafis, which was incredible considering they were complete infants in the political space. So all of a sudden, they had engaged. The Ikhwan al-Muslimin took power, as we know, with Muhammad Morsi. And that's when the problems began. You see, if you are completely disengaged with politics for generations, and then you engage overnight, you have no experience or understanding of how the whole system works, you're completely naive to the reality of how things should be done. And that's, I would say, the problems. They immediately went head-to-head with the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. They were the main opposition to the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and they ended up siding with Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, who was the man that overthrew the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, who's the current president at the moment, who's ruling with an iron fist. So it was really, a disaster in the making throughout those years. Something to learn from in terms of when you're out of power. We need to actually understand we have to have a vision for what happens if we have the opportunity to come into power. And that's something I feel that they did not have. After that, we have shifting positions in terms of what happened to Salafiyya after that. There were different groups emerging, and they were actually working with groups that you would think not possible previously. So we had the Salafis working with Sufis in different groups in the UAE, in Qatar, and that was essentially how things have developed since then. In the meantime, and this is the last thing before we break, in the meantime we had the other type of Salafi. So we had the evolution of Salafiyya from quietism, from not engaging, to making huge mistakes whilst engaging, to kind of this sort of midway place now. In fact, the Salafis are very confused in Saudi Arabia because we have a guy called Mohammed ibn Salman who's doing some crazy stuff in Saudi Arabia, and he's bringing about liberal reforms, cinemas. He invited Nicki Minaj to perform a concert. She refused. Imagine that. She refused him. It would have been okay if he said, okay, we've come to our senses, we're not going to invite you. But she was the one that was invited, and she ended up refusing because they're not liberal enough to women. Anyway, that's beside the point. The point is this. The Salafi position in Saudi Arabia is, okay, what do we do now? There's kind of a confusion as to where to go. What position do we take? Do we remain outside of politics, or do we intervene? So there's a kind of friction going on in this space that's emerging at the moment. So there's this, that's the situation we find Salafiyya at the moment. It's kind of in this halfway house where they want to engage, but they're not sure how. And then you have the militant or the jihadi Salafi movements that emerged from the 80s into the 90s. The Arab Spring collapse gave fuel to the fire of these movements, which led to different groups emerging. We can spend hours talking about that. That's not really the purpose of this, because I'm focusing on the mainstream Salafiyya, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, and the Turkish party, the AK party, which Erdogan came from, which we will spend the next half of this circle talking about, inshallah. But we're going to take a break now, as I believe it's time to take a break, inshallah. So, forgive me, this is a crash course. A lot of information is coming very quickly, and I'm going to have to be even quicker now because I see we've got about 25 minutes before Maghrib, and we want to talk about really a very, very important development in the Muslim world over the last 20 years. That is the rise of Erdogan and the AK party. And the reason that we need to focus on this, and I focused on the Ikhwan al-Muslimin because they were the most influential of the first half of the 20th century. I focused on Salafiyya because they were the most influential in the second half. And I'm focusing on AK now because Erdogan has been by far the most successful political Muslim leader that we have seen in this Ummah over the last 100 years. So it's absolutely vital that we actually look at the success, look at how and what happened, and what we can take from that. Because he has done more than anyone else in this Ummah over the last 100 years in terms of developing Islam in a political way, as opposed to the da'wah way that we spoke about with Salafiyya. To understand, we need to look very, very quickly at the backdrop before Erdogan came into power. So as we know, after World War I, the Ottoman Empire, which was based in Istanbul, in Turkey, it collapsed, it came apart, it was replaced with complete secularism, led by a man called Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the father of the Turks. During that period, Islam was pretty much outlawed. I mean, not technically, but pretty much. Hijab was banned, the Quran was not allowed in Arabic, for God's sake. It was in Turkish. The adhan was in Turkish. All kinds of religious expression in the Islamic schools were completely taken off the equation. They ripped the heart out of the Islamic culture from that country. Then After the death of Ataturk, 1948, I think, came elections. And through those elections came a loosening of the restrictions towards Islam. So some schools were permitted, Islamic schools were permitted, and they started to develop during that time. Now, this quick timeline that we're going to be talking about tells you one thing. The military were in charge for that whole period all the way up to 1997. There were 4 separate military coups during this time, from 1960 to 1997, meaning that the military were firmly in control of the politics of Turkey throughout that period. The reason being is because Ataturk had entrusted the military to be the guardians of the secular government or the secular country that it was. So if there were any sniffs towards Islamism, shall we say, well, I don't want to use that word, but towards Islamic determination, the military had the responsibility to step in to stop that from happening, which is why we saw the military constantly involved in political life. So the first coup happened in 1960, and the reason that happened is simply because the government was losing control at that time. They loosened Islamic restrictions. They weren't Islamic, but they were losing control themselves. Now, during the 60s, Islamic schools started to emerge, one of them being the Imam Hatip school, which is one of them which a young Rajab Tayyip Erdogan enrolled in. He became a student in 1966 in Imam Hatip school, which was a Muslim school that would sort of, bring up the next generation of imams for the country. So this man that we're about to talk about had an upbringing in Islam, and that was where he developed his love for the deen, love for the Quran, love for the Sunnah. Now, the second coup is interesting. It happened in 1971. Chaos was widespread in Turkey at that time. The economy had collapsed, and all we saw at that time was the right wing of the country, right-wing parties, left-wing parties at each other's throats. There was protests in the street, there was fighting, it was all over the place. Now, what's interesting during this period is that Islam has now got space to develop because people are getting sick and tired of the way things were going. They were sick and tired of the economy being messed up, and they were sick and tired of the right and the left being at each other's throats. So people started to turn towards the Islamic parties because they remained uninvolved. They didn't get involved in that political protesting on the streets, the anger, the fighting amongst each other. So they seemed disassociated from that. They seemed like a breath of fresh air. So people started to actually lean towards these groups that were emerging, like one group led by a man called Erbakan. It was called the National Salvation Party. Erbakan is this guy here on the left. He led the National Salvation Party. And this was a new Islamic political party that emerged in 1973. Erdogan was a student at that time, and he joined the student division of it. That was his first involvement in politics. They became kingmakers. They weren't ruling, but the very fact that they are now in the political process, this Muslim party, they were able to actually choose or lend their support to people of power. So they started to gain influence. So that meant that they were able to influence politics, give more freedom to political, to Islamic schools and Islamic developments in Turkey. Until 1980, the third military coup. And that was pretty much the end of the left, because with that coup, they removed the left-wing parties, they got rid of them, they jailed them. We're talking communists and all of those. They also banned the National Salvation Party because they could not tolerate the fact that there was a political Islamic party that was developing, gaining popularity. So they banned them, and they banned Erbakan from involving himself in politics. Until in 1983, he created another party, the Refah Party, which was another Muslim party. Again, Erdogan joined it. He was a youthful member of that party. They remained very insignificant, and they kind of just kept developing until 1997, when there was a fourth military coup. 1996, and so this is a lot of information, Erbakan became prime minister. Erbakan, remember, he's the leader of the Refah Party. Erdogan is part of the same party. They got power, A year later, the military took that power away from them. They could not tolerate what they saw in front of them, which was the development of political Islam in a secular country. They got rid of them and they retired Erbakan from politics altogether. So that was pretty much the end of the Refah Party. Now, in that time, particularly in the 1990s, this is where Erdogan starts to make his mark. With the fall of this man, Erbakan, and his pretty much retirement from mainstream politics, this man here is making a name for himself by not promoting himself as an Islamist. I don't like the term, but we're going to use it. He did not promote himself as an Islamist. He ran for the mayor of Istanbul in 1989, and he failed. He ran again in 1994 and succeeded. But what was interesting was Istanbul was an absolute disaster at that time. There was literally sewage on the streets. There were public services were a mess. The poor was widespread. There was prostitution, drugs, you name it. It was a mess. Erdogan came along and he started speaking for the poor. He didn't start preaching and he didn't start condemning. He started speaking for the poor and calling towards public services. And he appealed to them. Remember, he was being very intelligent. He was playing the long game. He's not overtly calling himself a Muslim. He's not overtly calling to Islam. He is just addressing the needs of the people at that time. He was even seen, with press photos with prostitutes, talking to them, speaking to them, and there were pictures of him with them. Right? He wasn't condemning and looking down upon these people and saying, look at these people, they've completely lost their deen. He was trying to connect with them and he was trying to help them. And that brought him a public following, which led to him winning in 1994. And with his victory, becoming the mayor of Istanbul, he brought in radical change. I'm not talking about Islamic change yet. He sorted out the sewage works. He sorted out the public services. He sorted out basic, education needs to the people. He took people out of the slums. He created housing, simple services like bus stops and all of these things. And he deliberately positioned himself at that time as secular. He didn't want to promote it because he knew what would happen if he did. He had the actual savvy nature he had the understanding of the politics around him. He understood what was possible and what was not possible at that time, and he played to his advantages. Even when he was being interviewed by a journalist, the journalist was asking about the prostitution and all of the problems of society. He said, why are you talking to me about prostitution when we don't even have buses that are running? We don't even have schools that are properly, working, functioning. So he was deliberately positioning himself in a position where he's not going to condemn society. He's not going to be talking about these issues of morality. He's going to sort things out first. And that led to him forming something after the Refah Party. Remember, the party of Erbakan, which he was a member of, was dissolved and made illegal by the military. He created his own party, the AKP, the Justice and Development Party. Now, that was formed in 2001, and it was deliberately distancing himself from any kind of Islamic movements. He distanced himself from his old mate Erbakan. He didn't want to be part of that because he knew what would happen if he did. He was playing the long game. And through the popularity that he achieved, and not only that, remember this, it wasn't just Muslims, it wasn't just Islamists in this party. He brought people in from other secular parties, centrists. So it wasn't just strictly Islamic. So it had the image of an inclusive party. And with the popularity that he developed, he won his first general election in 2002. And the first thing he did in that period from 2002 to 2007 was sort Turkey out. He wasn't going to promote himself, as overtly Islamic. There was no preaching, there was no rhetoric, there was no talk of any of these things that he does so now. All he did was sort out the economy, and my God, he was successful. He was radically successful. At that time, inflation was out of control in Turkey. At that time, public services were a mess. They had massive debts, and he sorted it all out. It was nothing short of an economic miracle. So he brought prosperity to the country. He removed the deficit of the country. He lowered inflation. He developed a pride. He developed industry, housing. He started building and public projects. So within that period, all he did was get the house in order, and he did so emphatically and so successfully that naturally you're going to create a lot of goodwill. So the popularity went through the roof. Remember, no overt talk of Islam at this point, no pushing towards any kind of Islamic movement at this point. He understands what is possible and what is not possible. He is savvy, and so are the people around him. So they're working with what they have. Then came the second term. And right at the beginning of the second term, there are issues, you see. And this is interesting here. The military are not stupid. They know his background. They know that he's Muslim, and they know that there's this danger that he's going to bring in some kind of anti-secular sort of agenda. And they are thinking about removing him, and that chance came in 2007. They even threatened to remove him. But the AKP ignored that threat and they carried on. And the reason they were able to do so is because of this man that you see in front of you here. His name is Fethullah Gulen. He developed a movement that began in 1966, the Gulenist movement. Now what this was we as Muslims, it's no good us protesting on the streets, right? Standing up with banners, shouting get a power. That's pointless. What we need to do to create an Islamic golden generation is to infiltrate every part of society, whether that be the civil service, whether that be the courts, whether that be the military. We need to get within these institutes of government and of wider society so that we can bring about change from the inside. So by this time, 2007, Gulen and his followers, by the way, Gulen is now in America, and he was since 1999, exiled, self-exiled, because of the anti-Muslim agenda in the country. So by 2007, Gulen and his movement had already deeply infiltrated the military, the courts, and all other parts of society, that he created an alliance with the AKP. They were working together because they both needed one another at that point. Erdogan needed them, they needed Erdogan. So because of that, the military had lost its teeth. They weren't able to take the action because of the Gulenists who were supporting Erdogan at that time. But there's also one more interesting thing that I want to mention. The EU. At the time, there was this big push for Turkey to join the EU. And I was thinking when I was watching it at the time, why does Erdogan really want to join the EU? Why join the EU? Simple. One, makes him look secular. Because people wanted to join the EU because it sort of ensured that, yeah, I'm secular, I'm going down that secular road. So it proved to the people that I'm a secularist, I'm not moving an Islamic agenda, number one. Number two, to join the EU, there are certain conditions and criteria. One of those is the military has to be subservient to government. You have to take powers away, you have to reform the military. So he used it as an excuse to take the teeth away from the military who have constantly been overthrowing government after government after government. He's saying, sorry, I can't do anything about it. We need to join the EU. You guys in the military want us to join the EU. We have to take the powers away. So they had to accept that if they wanted to join the EU, they had to accept leaving or seceding some of the power to Erdogan, which happened, which was excellent because it was a double win for him. Then, so again, Turkey continued to grow, it continued to develop, and Gulen is on side until the third term when problems started to emerge. 2011 to 15, the problem is political opposition has been destroyed. The military is now subservient. You had a marriage of convenience between Gulen and Erdogan. Now they don't have any enemy. They start fighting one another. There's a conflict of power now because Gulen and his movement are unable to reconcile with the AK party, so it's all-out war. I'm being very, very brief because I'm looking at the time. Extremely brief. But they're at each other's throats now. Not only that, there are movements now emerging against Erdogan, secular movements. They're getting unhappy because Erdogan has not freedom now. He's bringing in the Islamic agenda. He's talking overtly about Islam, and he's bringing in more and more policies towards Islam. He's building masajid everywhere, Islamic schools. There are more and more Islamic projects that are emerging. So people are looking over and hanging. They're thinking, what's going on to our secular state? What's happening here? So the secularists are getting very nervous. That led to all kinds of protests like the one that you see there. So there's all kinds of issues happening. until the fourth term with the 2016 coup, or the failed coup, when they tried to remove Erdogan. You see, this was instigated by Gulen and others amongst the seculars, so Gulen and his people within the military, but they were supported by other Muslim states like, for example, the UAE, who supported them at the time because they were always against Erdogan. Erdogan has this issue that he was supporting the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, he was supporting the Arab Spring, he was supporting the democratic process. UAE wanted him out, so they were happy to support this. And so were the West. The West were happy to support this. They didn't like what was happening in Turkey. So they attempted one last throw of the dice. They tried to remove Erdogan. Long story short, Erdogan on FaceTime, famously, he goes on FaceTime on national TV, he's on his iPhone, and he's literally calling the people on CNN Turkey to take to the streets and defend the republic from the military. They're not going to do it for a fifth time. And people respond in their masses. They take to the streets, they fight, and they force, they're jumping on tanks, as you can see, and they force and they cause it to fail. So it's an incredible moment for Erdogan, and it proved to him that he is still popular amongst the people. He even united the secularists at that time that did not want to see another military coup. Following this came the purge. And this is, I would say, the point at which I have to be critical with Erdogan, because I think now he has overstretched himself. Because after that, he started taking even more powers away from the military, from the media, from the press, from all other areas of government, such that he has really centralized power. So it's all upon him. So his Islamic project has become an Erdogan project, where it's become too much about him and not enough about the institutions of Islam, such that what happens when he goes? Is it able to carry on without him? It's too centrally focused, and that's my problem, you see. So generally when I assess it, before I talk about the overall lessons, and I want you to be patient because I think there are so many lessons to be had here. You see, he appealed to the needs of the people before talking about Islam. He understood the reality. If you start talking about Islam to a secular people that all they care about is their lives and getting their lives in order, they're not going to listen. He appealed to what they needed, which was dignity. So he did that first. He understood the psychology of these people, and he looked at the long term. He played the long game. He didn't introduce Islam originally. He gave them what they want, and then he brought it in. But is he now able to actually be flexible enough to adapt to the current situation at this time, which we can't talk about, I'm afraid, because there's so much regarding that. What I do want to talk about, because of the 5 minutes that we have, is the overall lessons of the 100 years. I'm sorry I had to brush over that because of the time. But the key thing is this. I'm going to give you 5 reflections that I took when I overlooked these 100 years. The first one is unity, obviously, is everything. Even we look at the time when the Khilafah fell. It was all about unity between the Turks and the Arabs. We can talk about that forever. We can talk about the split between the Salafis and the Ikhwanis and what a disaster it created in Egypt. We can talk about the Gulen and the AKP party, what disaster it created. Even now, amongst us in this country, the divisions between silly matters of fiqh and aqidah, when we are being attacked from all corners, we need to unify and we need to learn how to actually work with one another. That's the first thing. The second thing is, remember, all movements, regardless of how insignificant, do not belittle it, because everything starts with humble beginnings. But you have to have sincerity and you have to have high ambitions. Look what happened with Ikhwan al-Muslimin and Hassan al-Banna. Incredible to think that it was just literally an evening class for boys that turned into one of the biggest movements of the 20th century. You just make your steps towards doing something that's going to be beneficial to this ummah. With ikhlas, Allah will do the rest, regardless of how successful it is in this dunya. Remember Nuh alayhi salam, 950 years. Not much to show for it, but the ikhlas is there and the reward is there for him. Okay. Connect yourself to the sources. What we learned from this whole period is we went from a period where the Muslims were decapitated from the sources to people like the Salafi movement and the Ikhwan, bringing people back to the sources, because that's where the strength is. The Quran and the Sunnah is where everything else comes from. That's the fertile ground where everything else is built around. We have to be reflective, critical, dynamic. That's what I learned from these 100 years. The problem is, when movements start to fail, whether it be the Ikhwan or the Salafis or even the AKP now, the reason they fail is because they're not able to adapt, they're not dynamic, and they're not critical enough. They become echo chambers. We need to actually criticize each other. We need to look at each other and speak the truth to each other. When we have yes men surrounding us, that's when things start to collapse. And that's my worry for Turkey at the moment, that Erdogan does not have the critique around him that's going to help him move into the next phase. So we need to be reflective people. We need to actually look at how we can develop and change and evolve. And the final thing, in perhaps the couple of minutes that I have, know the world that surrounds you. The reason the AKP party was so successful is because they were fully acquainted with politics, with the world that was surrounding them. They understood the situation of the Ummah. They understood the situation of the politics. They knew what they could say and what they couldn't say. They knew what would land them in trouble because of their history, and they knew exactly how that they were going. They had a plan, they had a vision, and they had a strategy. And they implemented that strategy, and the success is evident. They were radically successful, the most successful political movement of the last 100 years for Muslims. So there is so much to be taken from that. And that really is what we need to actually understand. Yes, we have ulama, we have people that are excellent with fiqh and aqeedah, and we need them. But Islam cannot operate in a void. We need the groundwork, which is people that understand sociology and political theory. Because if we do not have that, all we have is Islam that's unable to operate and impose itself upon the modern world. So we need people in all areas that are able to actually allow the fuqaha and those that know hadith to operate and to actually use their knowledge to actually, benefit the ummah, benefit the world. Because one thing this world needs right now is Islam. As a collective, as humanity, we're on the precipice of disaster, whether it's moral or environmental or spiritual disaster. We're all on the precipice of disaster. Islam is needed more than ever at this moment in time. So it's upon us to actually become a bit smarter in the way we operate, which means knowing the world around us, which means entering into these other fields and not narrowing ourselves down to just fiqh and aqeedah. And I'll leave it there because I think the adhan is about to be called if anyone wants to have it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Friday Circle podcast. If you want to enjoy more, visit fridaycircle.co.uk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.